At my daughter's graduation, my brother asked why I never used the $30,000 he loaned me. My brother Nathan grabbed my shoulder during Sophie's graduation reception and said, "So, did the experimental treatment work, or did you end up going traditional?" I was holding a plastic cup of punch, watching my daughter laugh with her friends in her cap and gown, and his question made absolutely no sense. I turned to him, confused, and he continued, "The $30,000 I wired you 3 years ago for Sophie's treatment. Did it help?" The punch cup slipped from my hand, splashing across the gymnasium floor in slow motion. Rebecca, my wife, went completely rigid beside me, her smile frozen like a mask made of ice. Sophie never had any experimental treatment. Sophie was never sick, and I never received $30,000 from anyone. Nathan's face shifted from casual curiosity to concern as he watched my expression. He pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly, then turned the screen toward me. Bank transfer confirmation. May 15th, 3 years ago. $30,000 sent to an account ending in 8842. I stared at those numbers, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. That was Rebecca's personal checking account, the one she'd opened years ago for her freelance graphic design work. The account I never thought to question because we kept our finances mostly separate after she insisted it was easier for tax purposes. My mouth went dry as sandpaper. Nathan kept talking, something about how he'd liquidated some stocks and taken a loan against his 401k to help us during what I'd told him was Sophie's medical crisis. But his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Rebecca touched my arm, her fingers ice cold even through my suit jacket. "Honey, we should go check on the cake," she said, her voice tight and artificial. But Nathan wasn't done. He pulled up email after email on his phone, correspondence between us that I'd never seen before. Messages from my email address thanking him for the loan, providing updates on Sophie's condition, describing treatments and procedures that never happened. Each message was dated, time-stamped, detailed. My signature block at the bottom, my actual email address, but I'd never written any of them. I looked at Rebecca, and in that split second before she could reconstruct her expression, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Guilt. Not surprise, not confusion. Just pure, undiluted guilt. I'd been working as a senior project manager at a construction firm for 15 years when Sophie was 14 and starting high school. Rebecca had her graphic design clients, though her income was always unpredictable, sometimes bringing in $3,000 a month, sometimes nothing. We'd built a comfortable life in our 3-bedroom house outside Portland, nothing fancy but stable. Sophie was thriving, playing volleyball, maintaining a 3.8 GPA, talking about colleges. Nathan lived in Boston, worked in finance, and we'd stayed close despite the distance. We talked every few weeks, visited twice a year. He was Sophie's favorite uncle, always sending birthday cards with generous checks, always asking about her games and grades. When he'd mentioned around that time that we should catch up more, I'd agreed but got busy with a massive commercial project at work. Looking back now, that's when the emails must have started. The first red flag I'd missed completely was Rebecca's sudden insistence that we needed separate email accounts for household management. She'd set up a new Gmail for me, said it was for bills and important documents, kept it linked to her laptop for backup purposes. I'd thought she was being helpful, organizing our lives better. She'd always handled most of the household administration anyway, paying bills, managing accounts, dealing with school communications. I was working 60-hour weeks on the convention center renovation project, coming home exhausted. When she said she'd handle something, I trusted her. That trust had cost me $30,000, and I hadn't even known I'd lost it until this moment, standing in my daughter's graduation reception with my brother, showing me proof of my own betrayal. Nathan was still scrolling through his phone, his expression darkening as he realized something was very wrong. "You didn't know about this," he said, and it wasn't a question. Rebecca's hand tightened on my arm, her nails digging in hard enough to hurt through the fabric. "We should talk about this privately," she hissed, but Nathan ignored her. He pulled up another document, this one a PDF of a promissory note. My signature at the bottom, agreeing to pay him back over 10 years, interest-free, starting when Sophie turned 21. The signature looked perfect, identical to mine, because it probably was my signature, scanned and copied from some document Rebecca had access to. The date on the promissory note was May 20th, 3 years ago, 5 days after the initial transfer. Everything documented, official, legally binding. I grabbed Nathan's phone, zooming in on the bank transfer details. The routing number matched Rebecca's bank. The account number matched the account she'd shown me once, the one with a few $1,000s from her design work. But $30,000 had gone into that account 3 years ago, and I'd never seen a penny of it. My mind started racing backward through time, trying to remember that period. Sophie had been healthy, no medical issues at all. We'd taken a vacation that summer, nothing extravagant, just a week at the coast. Rebecca had seemed happier than usual, more relaxed, buying new clothes, getting her hair done more often. She'd said a few design clients had paid well. I'd been thrilled for her, proud that her business was picking up. The construction project had me working 12-hour days, and I'd been grateful she was handling everything at home so smoothly. Rebecca tried to pull me toward the door, but I yanked my arm away. Sophie was across the gym, posing for photos with her friends, completely unaware that her graduation party was about to implode. Nathan's wife, Jennifer, had joined us, sensing something wrong. She looked at Nathan's phone, then at Rebecca, then at me. "Oh my God," she whispered. Nathan's face had gone from concerned to furious. He'd taken out a loan against his retirement to help his brother's sick daughter, sacrificing his own financial security. He'd worried about Sophie, sent cards asking about her recovery, coordinated with what he thought was me about treatment updates. All of it lies, all of it carefully constructed by my wife, using my identity. The graduation coordinator announced that the cake would be served in 5 minutes, and the gym filled with cheerful chatter from families celebrating their kids. My hands started shaking so badly I had to shove them in my pockets. Rebecca leaned in close, her voice barely audible. "I was going to tell you. I needed the money for an emergency, and I knew you'd say no. I was paying it back slowly." But Nathan heard her. "You've had 3 years and $30,000, he said, his voice cold as winter steel. "Where is it?" Rebecca's face crumbled, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. The tears looked real. Her distress seemed genuine, but I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what was performance. I pulled Rebecca away from the crowd, into the hallway outside the gym where the bathrooms were. Nathan and Jennifer followed, forming a wall between us and the party. My mind was processing everything in fragments, unable to form coherent thoughts. $30,000, 3 years, medical crisis that never existed, emails I never sent, signatures I never made. "Show me your accounts," I said, my voice coming out harsh and unfamiliar. Rebecca shook her head, crying harder. "I can explain everything at home. Not here, not at Sophie's graduation." But Nathan pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling the police. This is wire fraud and identity theft." Rebecca's tears stopped instantly, her face going blank with panic. That transformation, from sobbing wife to caught criminal, told me everything I needed to know about which version of her was real. I grabbed Nathan's arm before he could dial. Sophie's graduation. We were at Sophie's graduation. Our daughter had just achieved something huge, had no idea her mother was a thief, and her family was disintegrating. "Not yet," I said, even though every cell in my body wanted to let Nathan make that call. "Give me 24 hours. Nathan looked at me like I was insane, and maybe I was, but I couldn't destroy Sophie's day like this. She'd remember this forever, not as her graduation, but as the day her parents' marriage exploded in public. Rebecca saw the opening and latched onto it. "Thank you, honey. I can explain everything, I promise. Just let me explain at home." But I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for Sophie, who deserved one more good memory before everything went to hell. We made it through the cake, through the photos, through the congratulations from other parents. I smiled and nodded and said appropriate things while my mind spun in circles. Rebecca stayed close to me, touching my arm, laughing at the right moments, playing the proud mother perfectly. Sophie glowed, hugging friends, promising to stay in touch, talking about her summer plans before starting at Oregon State in the fall. She'd gotten a partial scholarship, and Rebecca and I were covering the rest from my salary and savings. Except now I wondered how much of our savings was actually left, if Rebecca had stolen from more than just Nathan's loan. When we finally got to the car, Sophie in the back seat scrolling through photos on her phone, Rebecca reached for my hand. I pulled away like she'd burned me. The drive home took 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. Sophie chattered about the party, about her friends' college plans, about how excited she was for orientation in August. I made sounds of agreement while Rebecca stared out the window, silent now that she didn't have an audience. When we pulled into our driveway, Sophie bounded out, eager to change out of her dress and call her friends. Rebecca and I sat in the car after she went inside. "I'm sleeping in the guest room," I said. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to show me every account, every transaction, everything. If you lie to me even once, I'm calling the police myself." Rebecca nodded, fresh tears starting. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." But she'd meant for it to happen when she stole Nathan's money. She'd meant for it to happen when she forged my emails. She'd meant for it to happen when she lied for 3 years straight. I lay awake all night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, my phone in my hand. Nathan had texted every hour. "Are you okay? Do you need help? I'm getting a lawyer." I responded with short messages, asking him to wait, promising I'd handle it, begging him to give me time to figure out what to do. Jennifer called at midnight. She was a paralegal, had contacts at law firms, wanted to help. I thanked her and said I needed to see the full scope before taking action. She warned me that every day I waited gave Rebecca time to hide more evidence. I knew she was right, but I couldn't think clearly enough to know what to do first. Around 3 a.m., I got up and walked through the house, looking at everything differently now. The new kitchen backsplash from 2 years ago, the upgraded furniture in the living room, Rebecca's expensive laptop, her designer handbags in the closet. Had all of this come from Nathan's money, bought with theft and lies? Morning came with gray light through the blinds and Sophie's alarm going off down the hall. Sunday morning, the day after graduation. I heard her in the shower, heard Rebecca moving around in our bedroom. I made coffee with shaking hands, the mechanical routine, the only thing keeping me grounded. Rebecca came into the kitchen, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her eyes red and swollen. She'd either been crying all night or had made herself cry for effect. I couldn't tell anymore, couldn't trust any emotional response from her. "Sophie's going to brunch with friends at 10, Rebecca said quietly. "We can talk after she leaves." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without yelling. Sophie emerged dressed and happy, kissing my cheek, grabbing a granola bar, promising to be back by mid-afternoon. The door closed behind her, and suddenly the house felt suffocating. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. Her hands trembled as she logged into her bank account. I stood behind her, watching over her shoulder, photographing the screen with my phone. The account ending in 8842 showed a current balance of $247. I scrolled back through the transaction history, my stomach dropping with each swipe. May 15th, 3 years ago, deposit of $30,000 from Nathan's account. Then within days, $5,000 to quote 25, quote $3,200 to quote 26, quote $4,800 to quote 27, quote more transfers, more companies, more money hemorrhaging out in massive chunks. By July that year, the entire $30,000 was gone, scattered across a dozen different transactions to businesses I'd never heard of. Rebecca's face was buried in her hands. She whispered, "The investment companies." I pulled out my phone and started searching each name. Luxury Ventures LLC came back with pages of fraud complaints and a class action lawsuit. Summit Financial Group had been shut down by the SEC 2 years ago for running a pyramid scheme. Premier Trading Co. had a website that looked legitimate, but reviews that screamed scam. Every single company Rebecca had sent money to was either fake, fraudulent, or defunct. She'd lost $30,000 to scammers, and instead of telling me, instead of going to the police, instead of being honest with Nathan, she'd covered it up for 3 years. I felt sick, physically ill, like the floor was tilting under my feet. I said, my voice hollow. Rebecca sobbed harder, nodding. Quote 31. But the transactions didn't stop there. I kept scrolling through her account, finding more. Regular withdrawals of $500, $300, $400 every few weeks. "What are these?" I asked, pointing at the screen. Rebecca wiped her face, not meeting my eyes. I was paying back Nathan, slowly, in cash. I was going to tell him it was from my design work. I opened my Photos app and checked the amounts. In 3 years, she'd withdrawn maybe $18,000 in cash. Her face went even paler. She was lying. I could see it in how her eyes shifted, how her shoulders tensed. That money had gone somewhere else, somewhere she didn't want me to know about. I grabbed the laptop from her and started opening other browser tabs. Her credit card accounts logged in automatically. The first one showed a balance of $8,200. The second showed $6,400. The third showed $11,900. Over $26,000 in credit card debt across 3 cards I didn't know existed. My vision started to blur at the edges, and I had to sit down before I passed out. Rebecca tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other. The credit cards were in her name only, for her business expenses, but the design work had slowed down, and she'd been using them to cover living expenses while trying to fix the investment situation. She'd been paying minimums, juggling balances, taking cash advances on one card to pay another. The financial house of cards she'd built was collapsing, and she'd kept me completely in the dark while it happened. I opened my own banking app on my phone, checking our joint account. The balance looked normal, about $12,000, our usual cushion, but I'd been automatically transferring $2,000 every month from my paycheck into this account for years. I did the math quickly. Over 3 years, that should have accumulated to way more than $12,000, even accounting for regular expenses. "You've been pulling from our joint account too," I said, and it wasn't a question. Rebecca nodded miserably, but she wasn't going to replace anything. She'd stolen $30,000, lost it to scams, racked up $26,000 in secret debt, drained our savings, and lied about all of it for 3 years. The scope of the disaster was so massive I couldn't comprehend it. My phone rang. Nathan. I answered it, stepping out onto the back deck where Rebecca couldn't hear. Quote 38, Nathan said, his voice tight with anger and hurt. Quote 39. I leaned against the railing, watching a neighbor mow their lawn. Everything so normal out there while my life imploded. Quote 40. I said, the words tasting like ash. Quote 41. Nathan was silent for a long moment. Then, quote 42. I understood. If someone had done this to me, I'd want justice too. But this was Sophie's mother, my wife of 19 years, the woman I'd built a life with, had a child with, trusted completely. Give me until Monday, I said. Let me talk to a lawyer first, figure out the best way to protect Sophie in all this. Nathan agreed, reluctantly. He gave me the name of his attorney, a criminal defense lawyer named Margaret Voss, who also handled family law. I called her office immediately, left a message explaining the situation in broad terms, and asked for an emergency consultation. Her paralegal called back within an hour and scheduled me for Monday morning at 8 a.m. I spent the rest of Sunday in the guest room, doors locked, researching identity theft laws in Oregon, reading about wire fraud penalties, trying to understand the legal nightmare Rebecca had created. Sophie came home that afternoon, happy and exhausted, and asked if we wanted to order pizza for dinner. I forced myself to act normal, to eat pizza and listen to her talk about her friends' plans and her excitement about college. Rebecca sat across from me, barely eating, her eyes red and swollen. Sophie noticed, but accepted Rebecca's excuse about being emotional about graduation. After dinner, Sophie went to her room to pack for a week-long camping trip with friends, leaving the next morning. She'd been planning this trip for months, and I wasn't going to ruin it by imploding her family right before she left. Rebecca tried to talk to me again that evening, but I held up my hand. We're done talking until I meet with an attorney tomorrow. Don't touch any accounts. Don't transfer anything. Don't do anything. If you do, I'm calling the police myself. Monday morning arrived with Sophie packed and gone by 7 a.m., picked up by her friend's parents for the camping trip. I drove to Margaret Voss's office in downtown Portland, a converted Victorian house near the courthouse. Margaret was in her mid-50s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that immediately put me at ease. I spent 2 hours telling her everything, showing her Nathan's texts, the bank transfer confirmations, Rebecca's accounts, the credit card debt. Margaret took notes on a legal pad, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, Your wife committed multiple felonies. Wire fraud, identity theft, potentially forgery. Your brother has grounds for both criminal and civil prosecution, and you need to protect yourself because you're legally married to her, which means you could be liable for her debts. That possibility hadn't even occurred to me. Margaret explained that Oregon was a community property state, which meant debts incurred during marriage belonged to both spouses, even if only one person knew about them. Rebecca's $26,000 in credit card debt could become my problem. Her theft of Nathan's money could potentially entangle me in legal consequences. Margaret recommended I file for divorce immediately and legal separation to protect my assets. She also recommended I get a forensic accountant involved to trace every dollar and figure out the full scope of the damage. Her office worked with Thomas Keller, a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud cases. She called him right then, and he agreed to meet with me that afternoon. Thomas Keller's office was in a nondescript building near the airport, fluorescent lights and cubicles, nothing fancy. Thomas himself was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with glasses and a methodical way of speaking that inspired confidence. I gave him access to Rebecca's accounts, explained the situation, and asked him to trace every transaction from the day Nathan's money arrived. He said it would take a few days, but he'd have a preliminary report by Friday. Meanwhile, Margaret had started drafting divorce papers, asking me questions about assets, property, custody arrangements. Sophie was 18, so custody wasn't an issue, but everything else was. The house was in both our names. My retirement account had grown significantly over 19 years. Our cars, our possessions, everything would need to be divided. I drove home around 4 p.m., exhausted and numb. Rebecca's car was in the driveway, and when I walked in, she was at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. She looked up with desperate hope. Quote, 47. I looked at the list. Her laptop, maybe worth $800 used. Her camera equipment, maybe $2,000. Her jewelry, mostly costume pieces with maybe one decent necklace, worth $1,500. Her 10-year-old Nissan, worth maybe $4,000. All of it together might bring in $10,000, less than a third of what she'd stolen from Nathan, and it didn't even touch the credit card debt. Quote 48, I said flatly. Rebecca started crying again. Quote 49. But it was too late for plans and promises. I sat down across from her, and her face crumpled when she saw my expression. Quote 50, I said. Quote 51. Rebecca's face went from pale to chalk white. No, please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. I shook my head. You stole $30,000, forged my signature, committed identity theft, and hid it for 3 years. You destroyed my brother's retirement. You racked up $26,000 in debt I didn't know about. You drained our savings. There's nothing to fix. Rebecca reached across the table, grabbing my hands. I pulled them back. I made mistakes, but I love you. I love Sophie. Please don't throw away 19 years. But she'd already thrown them away when she chose to steal instead of asking for help, when she chose lies instead of truth. Nathan called that evening, asking for updates. I told him about Margaret Voss, about the forensic accountant, about filing for divorce. He was quiet for a moment, then said, quote 55, quote, but he didn't sound sorry enough to change his mind about prosecution, and I didn't blame him. He'd sacrificed his retirement to help what he thought was a family emergency. He deserved justice, even if it destroyed Sophie's mother. Nathan said Margaret had contacted him, and they were coordinating. He'd be filing his criminal complaint by the end of the week. Jennifer got on the phone, her voice gentle, telling me they'd support me however they could, that Sophie could stay with them any time if things got bad. I thanked her, my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name. Rebecca moved into the guest room that night without me asking. Sophie was gone until the following Sunday, which gave me a week to figure things out before having to tell her that her parents were getting divorced and her mother was probably going to be arrested. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything. Work had given me the week off for Sophie's graduation activities, and I spent it in a fog, meeting with lawyers, talking to the forensic accountant, trying to understand how my entire life had turned into a crime drama. Thomas Keller called me Wednesday morning with preliminary findings. The news was somehow worse than I'd thought possible. Rebecca hadn't just lost the money to investment scams. She'd also been gambling online. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there. But the amounts grew. By the time Nathan's money came in, she was losing hundreds of dollars a day on online poker and sports betting. The $30,000 had gone into a desperate attempt to win back what she'd already lost, a classic gambler's mistake. Thomas had pulled transaction records going back 5 years. Rebecca had been gambling for years, hiding it perfectly. The design work income she'd claimed came from occasional freelance jobs, but most of what she said she earned was actually money from gambling wins or credit card cash advances. She'd win occasionally, just enough to keep the addiction alive, but overall she'd lost over $80,000 in 5 years. $80,000. The number was so staggering I couldn't process it. Some of that was Nathan's money, some was our savings, some was credit card debt, but all of it was gone, lost to online casinos and betting sites. When I confronted Rebecca with this information that evening, she finally broke completely. She admitted everything, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. The gambling had started small during a stressful period when Sophie was in middle school and work was slow. It made her feel something other than anxious. She'd win sometimes, and the rush was addictive. She'd tried to stop countless times but always went back. When Nathan's money arrived, she'd seen it as a chance to win big, pay off her debts, and start over. Instead, she'd lost it all and dug the hole deeper. I called Margaret Voss and told her about the gambling addiction. She said it didn't change the legal situation, but it might be relevant for sentencing if criminal charges were filed. She recommended Rebecca get into treatment immediately, both for the gambling and for mental health. It might show good faith to prosecutors and judges. Rebecca agreed to enter an intensive outpatient program, starting immediately. She called a treatment center that night and got an assessment scheduled for Friday. I watched all of this from a distance, feeling nothing. The woman crying in my guest room was a stranger who'd worn my wife's face for 3 years while committing felonies and destroying our family. I didn't know how to feel anything but numb. Thomas Keller delivered his full report on Friday. It was 53 pages of transactions, patterns, and analysis. He'd traced every dollar from Nathan's transfer through the maze of Rebecca's accounts. Some had gone to legitimate expenses, groceries, and utilities, but most had been gambled away. He'd also found evidence of more debt I didn't know about. Rebecca had taken out a $15,000 personal loan from an online lender, putting the house up as collateral without my knowledge. Since the house was in both our names, she'd forged my signature on the loan documents. Another felony. The loan had a predatory 18% interest rate, and she'd missed the last 2 payments. We were 60 days from foreclosure. The room spun. Our home, Sophie's childhood home, was about to be taken because Rebecca had forged my signature and missed payments I didn't know existed. I called Margaret immediately, explaining the new crisis. She said we could fight the foreclosure based on the forged signature, but it would take time and legal fees. She filed an emergency motion that afternoon, requesting a hearing to stop the foreclosure and void the loan based on identity theft. Saturday morning, I sat down and wrote out everything that needed to happen. First, stop the foreclosure. Second, finalize the divorce and separate my finances completely. Third, support Nathan's criminal prosecution of Rebecca. Fourth, figure out how to tell Sophie that her mother was a criminal and our family was destroyed. Fifth, somehow keep living through all of this. Margaret had scheduled the foreclosure hearing for next Friday. The divorce papers were ready to be served. Nathan was filing his criminal complaint on Monday. Everything was moving forward like a freight train I couldn't stop. Rebecca spent the weekend in the guest room, occasionally emerging to apologize or explain or beg. I stopped responding. There was nothing left to say. Sophie came home Sunday evening from her camping trip, sunburned and happy. She hugged me, showing me pictures on her phone, telling stories about their adventures. Rebecca tried to hug her too, but Sophie sensed something wrong immediately. She asked, looking between us. I took a deep breath. Quote, 58. We sat in the living room, Sophie on the couch between us, her expression shifting from confused to scared. I explained it as simply as I could. Uncle Nathan had loaned us money for an emergency that didn't exist. Mom had taken the money without telling me. She'd lost it gambling. She'd also hidden a lot of debt and forged legal documents. We were getting divorced, and there might be criminal charges. Sophie's face went through about 12 emotions in 30 seconds. Confusion, shock, disbelief, anger, hurt. She looked at Rebecca. Quote 59. Rebecca nodded, tears streaming. Quote 60. Sophie stood up, backing away from both of us. Quote 61, she asked. Quote 62. Rebecca couldn't answer. Sophie turned to me. Did you know? I shook my head. Found out at your graduation, when Nathan asked about the money. Sophie's face crumbled and she ran to her room, slamming the door. I heard her crying through the walls. and it was the worst sound I'd ever heard. I gave Sophie an hour, then knocked on her door. She let me in, her eyes red and swollen. We sat on her bed, and she leaned against me like she had when she was small. "Is this why you guys have been weird all week?" I nodded. "I didn't want to ruin your graduation or your camping trip." Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then, "What happens now?" I explained about the divorce, the lawyers, the criminal charges. Sophie listened, processing, then asked, "Are we going to lose the house?" I explained about the foreclosure, about fighting it, about trying to stop it. Sophie looked around her room, at the walls she'd decorated, at the memories packed into every corner. Her voice broke. I held her while she cried, promising we'd figure it out, knowing I couldn't guarantee anything. Monday morning, Nathan officially filed his criminal complaint with the Portland Police Department, Economic Crimes Unit. Detective James Garrett was assigned to the case, a 20-year veteran who specialized in fraud and identity theft. He called me Monday afternoon, asking me to come in for an interview. I drove to the precinct and spent 3 hours walking him through everything. Detective Garrett was thorough, asking detailed questions about timelines, accounts, communications. He reviewed all the documentation I'd brought, the bank transfers, the forged emails, the promissory note. He explained that the case was strong, with clear evidence of intent and harm. The district attorney's office would review it and decide whether to file charges. Given the amount involved and the multiple felonies, he expected they would prosecute. Rebecca received a visit from Detective Garrett on Wednesday. She called me afterward, hysterical, saying the detective had questioned her for 2 hours and told her to expect formal charges soon. She'd admitted everything, cooperated completely, and now realized she was probably going to jail. Her gambling treatment counselor had told her that honesty was part of recovery, so she'd confess to everything without a lawyer present. I called Margaret, who said Rebecca's confession had basically sealed her fate. No prosecutor would pass up a case where the defendant admitted to everything. Margaret recommended Rebecca get a criminal defense attorney immediately. Rebecca called someone named Gerald Finch, who specialized in white-collar crime. He wasn't cheap, $350 an hour, and Rebecca didn't have any money, so I ended up paying his retainer with money from our rapidly depleting joint account. The foreclosure hearing arrived on Friday morning. I sat in a courtroom with Margaret while a judge reviewed Thomas Keller's forensic report and the evidence of forgery. The online lender's attorney argued that I was married to Rebecca and should have known about the loan. Margaret countered that identity theft between spouses was still identity theft, and I couldn't be held liable for fraudulent documents I never signed. The judge asked pointed questions, examined the forged signature, and reviewed the timeline. After an hour of arguments, he ruled in our favor. The loan was voided based on fraud, and the foreclosure was stopped. The house was safe, at least for now. I felt relief for about 5 seconds before remembering that we still had $26,000 in Rebecca's credit card debt, a divorce to finalize, and criminal charges pending. Sophie started seeing a therapist named Dr. Patricia Huang, recommended by her school counselor. Dr. Huang specialized in family trauma and helped Sophie process the betrayal, the lies, and the uncertainty about the future. Sophie told me after her second session that Dr. Huang helped her understand that her mother's addiction didn't mean Rebecca didn't love her, but it also didn't excuse what Rebecca had done. Sophie was angry, hurt, and confused all at once. She asked if she could stay with Nathan and Jennifer for the rest of the summer, get away from Portland and all the chaos. I talked to Nathan, who enthusiastically agreed. Sophie flew to Boston the following week, and I was alone in the house with Rebecca, who barely left the guest room. The district attorney filed formal charges against Rebecca on a Thursday afternoon in July. 3 counts of identity theft, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of forgery. Each charge carried potential prison time. Gerald Finch, her attorney, called me to discuss strategy. He wanted to pursue a plea deal, argue for probation based on Rebecca's gambling addiction and her cooperation with the investigation. He asked if I'd be willing to write a letter to the judge explaining that Rebecca was sick, not malicious, that she needed treatment rather than prison. I told him I'd think about it. Nathan, when I called him, said he'd oppose any deal that didn't include restitution and some jail time. He'd been hurt financially and emotionally, and he wanted justice, not excuses. I spent a week wrestling with what to do. Rebecca was Sophie's mother. Prison would devastate Sophie. would mean Sophie grew up with an incarcerated parent, but Rebecca had also committed serious crimes, had stolen from my brother, had destroyed our family with lies. What message would it send to Sophie if there were no consequences? Margaret Voss advised me that my opinion would matter to the judge, but ultimately, the prosecutor would make the call on any plea deal. I decided to write a letter that was honest. I acknowledged Rebecca's gambling addiction, acknowledged that she needed treatment, but also stated that she needed to face consequences for her actions. I didn't recommend prison or probation, just stated facts and let the judge decide. The plea negotiations took months. Gerald Finch met with the prosecutor's office multiple times, trying to work out terms. The prosecutor wanted 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and restitution of the full $30,000 to Nathan. Gerald countered with probation only, intensive treatment, and restitution over time. They went back and forth while Rebecca attended gambling addiction treatment 5 days a week, and the divorce proceedings ground forward. Margaret had drafted a settlement agreement that gave me the house, my retirement account, and most of our remaining assets. Rebecca would keep her car and her personal possessions, but would be responsible for all her credit card debt. Sophie was 18, so custody wasn't an issue, but Rebecca wanted the right to see her. I didn't oppose it, but I told Sophie it was her choice. Sophie said she needed time before she was ready to talk to her mother. September arrived, and Sophie started at Oregon State. She decided to live on campus rather than commute from home, wanting distance and independence. I helped her move into her dorm, met her roommates, tried to act like a normal parent doing normal parent things. Sophie hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes. She said, quote 70, I held her tight. She went to class, started her new life, while I drove back to Portland alone. Nathan and Jennifer had kept Sophie for most of the summer, giving her space and normalcy. I'd visited twice, grateful that she had them when I was barely functional. The plea deal was finally reached in October. Rebecca would plead guilty to 1 count of identity theft and 1 count of wire fraud in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She'd receive 12 months in county jail followed by 5 years of probation, mandatory gambling treatment, and restitution of $30,000 to Nathan over 10 years. The prosecutor had insisted on jail time given the severity of the crimes and the amount involved. Gerald Finch told Rebecca it was the best deal she'd get, and she accepted it. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for November. I attended with Nathan and Jennifer. Sophie chose not to come, saying she couldn't watch her mother be sentenced to jail. I understood. The courtroom was cold and formal, with Rebecca sitting at the defense table in a gray suit, her hair pulled back, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The judge read through the charges, the plea agreement, and the victim impact statements. Nathan had written a statement describing how the theft had affected him financially and emotionally, how he'd trusted me and been betrayed. I'd written my statement about the damage to our family, the lies, the trauma Sophie experienced. Gerald Finch argued for leniency based on Rebecca's addiction and her efforts at recovery. The prosecutor countered that Rebecca had committed calculated fraud over years and needed to face appropriate consequences. The judge listened to everyone, reviewed the psychiatric evaluations and treatment records, and then imposed the agreed sentence. 12 months in county jail, 5 years of probation, mandatory treatment, and restitution. Rebecca would report to begin her sentence in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were surreal. Rebecca stayed in the guest room, packing her things, preparing to lose a year of her life. She tried to talk to Sophie on the phone, but Sophie kept the conversations short and superficial. Sophie was angry, hurt, and nowhere near ready to forgive. Rebecca wrote her letter after letter, apologizing, explaining, trying to make Sophie understand. Sophie read them, but didn't respond. I felt sorry for Rebecca in moments, seeing her cry over the relationship with Sophie that she'd destroyed. But then I'd remember the $30,000, the lies, the forged signatures, and the sympathy would evaporate. She'd made her choices, and these were the consequences. Rebecca reported to county jail on a Monday morning in mid-November. I didn't go with her. Her sister drove her, called me afterward to say Rebecca was processed and placed in the general population. The divorce was finalized a week later. Our marriage of 19 years officially dissolved. I felt nothing, just numbness and exhaustion. Sophie came home for Thanksgiving, and we had a quiet dinner, just the two of us. She asked about Rebecca, and I told her that her mom was in jail, was attending treatment programs there, and was scheduled to serve 8 months with 4 months off for good behavior. Sophie nodded, processing. "Do you think I should visit her?" she asked. I told her that was her decision, and I'd support whatever she chose. Sophie decided to write Rebecca a letter instead of visiting. She gave me a copy to read, and it was brutally honest. Sophie wrote about how betrayed she felt, how the lies had damaged her ability to trust, how angry she was that her mother had stolen from family. But she also wrote that she loved her mother, hoped she got better, and needed time and space before they could rebuild anything. She mailed it, and then went back to school. Nathan called regularly, checking on me, on Sophie, making sure we were okay. The $30,000 restitution was being paid in monthly installments of $250, directly from Rebecca's jail wages, and eventually from whatever job she got after release. It would take 10 years to repay, but at least it was something. Winter arrived cold and gray. I went to work, came home to an empty house, and tried to figure out how to live a life I didn't recognize. Sophie thrived at college, made new friends, joined clubs, called me every few days to check in. She'd decided to major in accounting, said she wanted to understand money and make sure she never made her mother's mistakes. I was proud of her resilience, her strength, her determination to build something good from something terrible. Dr. Huang told me Sophie was processing the trauma in healthy ways, using therapy and support systems effectively. Sophie's ability to recover gave me hope that maybe we'd all eventually heal from this. Rebecca's release was scheduled for July, 8 months into her sentence. She'd completed every treatment program available, had been a model inmate, and had earned maximum good behavior credits. Her probation officer, a woman named Carol Diaz, called me to discuss the transition. Rebecca would need a place to live, a job, continued treatment, and strict monitoring. Carol asked if Rebecca could stay at the house temporarily while she got on her feet. I said no, absolutely not. Margaret helped me draft a formal letter stating that Rebecca was not welcome at my home and that she needed to make other arrangements. Rebecca's sister agreed to let her stay in her spare room until she could afford her own place. Rebecca got out on a Thursday morning. She called me that evening from her sister's house, her voice tentative and hopeful. Quote, 73, she said. I told her Sophie was still in school and hadn't decided if she was ready. Rebecca asked if she could write more letters, and I said that was between her and Sophie. The conversation was awkward, full of pauses and careful words. Rebecca asked if I thought she'd ever have a relationship with Sophie again. I said I didn't know, that Sophie needed time, that trust was earned slowly. Rebecca thanked me for talking to her and hung up. I sat in my kitchen, in the house we'd shared for 17 years, and felt the weight of everything that had been lost. Sophie came home for the summer in August. She'd decided to get a campus apartment with roommates for her sophomore year, wanting independence and space from Portland's ghosts. She asked about Rebecca, and I told her that her mother was living with her aunt, working at a call center, attending treatment, and complying with probation. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. She said, I told her I'd support whatever she decided. Sophie met with Rebecca the following week at a Starbucks near campus. She came home afterward looking drained but not devastated. It was hard, she said, but I needed to hear her apologize in person. I needed to tell her how much she hurt me. I asked if she planned to see Rebecca again. Eventually, Sophie said, but slowly, very slowly. It's been 2 years now since Sophie's graduation. Nathan and I are closer than ever, talking weekly, visiting regularly. He and Jennifer have become Sophie's second parents, providing stability and support when everything else collapsed. The $30,000 restitution continues in monthly payments, a constant reminder of what Rebecca did. Sophie is thriving at Oregon State, maintaining a 3.7 GPA, planning to pursue her CPA certification. She sees Rebecca once every few months, carefully rebuilding a relationship on her own terms. Rebecca works her call center job, attends mandatory treatment, and complies with probation requirements. She'll be on probation for 3 more years. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.